It's my pleasure to welcome you to the RC21 conference here in Antwerp, where most people are not, but some of us are. I'm going to introduce the main organizers of the conference to you. My name is Talja Blokland. I'm the president of RC21. The big work for this conference, however, has been done by the team here in Antwerp. So I'm going to introduce to you Stijn Oosterlink, who is the professor in urban sociology at the University of Antwerp and chair of the Urban Studies Institute. And together with his scientific committee, but especially with the local organizing team of Elisabeth van Wijmeers, Fatima Laoukili, Michiel van Dam and Karen Bove, they've done all the work hosting this conference this year. Unfortunately, it has to be digital. Stijn, thank you for doing all the work, and I'm going to give over to you.
Thank you, Talja, and welcome also from my side, everybody, to this year's RC21 conference in Antwerp, but unfortunately online. So, as Talja said, my name is Stijn Oosterlink, and I was chairing the local organizing team to host this conference. The conference this year is titled Sensing and Shaping the City, Power, People and Place. And as you all know, the conference or the event was settled to take place last year at almost exactly the same time, but was postponed due to the COVID-19 measures and the health concerns around COVID-19. However, we were determined not to have another year without an RC21 conference, even if it had to be online, even if it wasn't under the circumstances that we chose. So here we are today with the RC21 conference in 2021. And we're absolutely delighted to welcome you to this year's event for 3 days full of urban studies, research and debate. And we have 7 plenary sessions or semi-plenary sessions, and no less than 142 slots for paper sessions. So there's plenty for every body of you to choose from in the next 2 or 3 days. With 850 registered participants, there are also a lot of colleagues from around the world to interact with over the coming 3 days. And we wish you an interesting and exciting conference. And I will now introduce to you the rector of the University of Antwerp, Herman van Hoetem, who's been a very big supporter of urban studies research at our university, and he would like to welcome you also to the conference.
Good afternoon for those of you participating. Of the Research Committee 21 conference. My name is Herman van Goetem and I am the rector of the University of Antwerp, this year's host of the RC21 conference. I wished I could have welcomed you in Antwerp at the city campus of our university, and when in 2018 we proposed to host a conference, we could not have foreseen that a global pandemic would make the organization of a physical conference impossible. But still, here we are, with only 1 year of delay. Urban studies is an important field of study for the University of Antwerp. Over the past decade, the university leadership has recognized this field of study as one of its main research strengths and is investing significant resources in the Antwerp Urban Studies Institute. The Antwerp Urban Studies Institute is an interdisciplinary platform for research and expertise on a whole range of urban problems and questions, not only in the social sciences and humanities, but also including medical and engineering sciences. Antwerp is a vibrant port city with a long and rich history as a hub for international commerce. It is also a great laboratory for contemporary urban problems, ranging from learning how to live together in densely populated and super diverse neighborhoods, over the traffic congestion and pollution related to Antwerp's position as a major logistical gateway into Western Europe, to the lack of access to affordable housing and decent jobs for low-income families, often with a migration background. We believe that we as scientists have an important role to play in addressing these problems. We also believe that urban studies, due to its focus on the city and its governance, its interdisciplinary nature and its commitment to social change, is well placed to play this role. 2020 was meant to be an important year for urban studies in Antwerp. We were supposed to host both the RC21 Urban Sociology Conference and the European Urban History Association Conference in 1 year. COVID-19 prevented this from happening, but we are very happy that with 1 year of delay, we can welcome so many of you onto what promises to be a great conference. I wish you an extraordinary experience and all the best.
Okay, we have a second word of welcome now from the alderman of social and ecological or environmental affairs from the city of Antwerp. So welcome, Tom Meus, and thank you for welcoming the audience.
Thank you, Stijn. I'm very honored to welcome you in our city. Antwerp, in fact, is a pocket-sized metropolis, we call it. Antwerp people are self-confident, self-conscious, kind arrogant. But in fact, we are a kind of provincial city, but with huge opportunities in order to tackle 21st century problems we all face in our urban regions, that is social and environmental challenge. So I'm very honored to welcome you here, a city of 530,000 inhabitants and 178 different nationalities, which are all professors in living apart together. We have a huge experience and a huge experience in living apart together. And so the main challenge is, how can we really live together in Antwerp? I must say, we are a city without huge tensions. We don't burn down mosques. If tensions in Israel are going up, we have a huge Jewish Orthodox community here, a huge Arab community too. There are no tensions which are headlined in the press. So, but how can we shift towards really living together? As an alderman for social affairs, well, that keeps me going. But we have to, and I hope you find some solutions in order to tackle two of our main, I think, social problems. That is, Director Van Goetem mentioned it already: an affordable housing crisis and a labor market paradox. We are a welfare city. We host one of the biggest ports in Europe. We host the second largest petrochemical cluster in the world. We have a lot of jobs to offer to people, but unfortunately we still have a high unemployment rate of about 50% now. And so how can we really solve that labor market paradox? As an alderman for Vice Mayor for Social Affairs, that keeps me awake at night, still looking for solutions, and hope you can deliver one. So I hope you turn the theme of the conference, Sensing the City, into sensing inhabitants, sensing people, and not only politicians, but all the Antwerp people. Let me end up with this. It's a kind of a huge party in Europe today, because the European Commission is ready to decide on a Fit for 55 plan in order to tackle the climate challenges in Europe. And that, in that case, in that domain, we have a really opportunity here in Antwerp with our port area. We have enough, for example, waste heat in order to heat up the entire city. So the port, the economy of our city, can heat up all inhabitants in a non-fossil fuel way. So that's just one reason I'd like to give you, a technological reason I know, to invite you to our city, well, later on this year or in the coming years or in this decade. It's all going to happen in Antwerp. I hope we'll convince you about that. You're really welcome. in the years to come to visit our beautiful city with some of the challenges I mentioned earlier. I wish you a very inspiring, a very nice conference, and hope we see each other in our beautiful city and port area. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Alderman Tom Meus, for welcome all the people to Antwerp, if it only virtually. This is a conference in an online environment, as you all know by now, and there's a bit of an unusual environment for us still after 1 year and a half to have a conference in this kind of environment. So Talja and me saw it fit to start the conference with a brief reflection on what it means to conference in pandemic times. We could open this conference by saying how much we would have loved to have all of you here in Antwerp, or in fact in any other urban setting in which we could have be physically co-present. And I think you would all wholeheartedly agree that being able to congregate in a concrete place, to sense a place, and the colleagues assembling in that place is to be preferred over an online meeting, over the online meeting that we will have in the next 3 days. And still, the long preparations for this conference, the multiple moments of consideration, whether we should postpone the conference once again or stick with the agreed date. I think we delayed 3 times or 2 times the conference. And the long list of abstracts we received for this conference, the many registered participants, all suggests that indeed conferencing in one way or another is a vital aspect of academic life, even if it happens under circumstances not of our own choosing. But what is about conferences as an embodied experiencing of traveling long distances, often very long distances, and getting together in physical places? What is it to this embodied experience of conferencing that matters so much to us? To refer to the subtitle of the conference, what does it mean to conference? What does it mean to our experience of people, of place, and of power that we are not physically co-present to have this conference? What does it mean that our interactions will be mediated through an online platform with all its technical opportunities, its possibilities, but also its constraints? Let us first reflect on people. What does it mean for our experience of people? Now, after more than a year, almost a year and a half, of online teaching and meetings, we have learned all too well that we do not leave our bodies behind when we go online. We will still be tired, or hungry, or both at the end of the session, or annoyed by an argument we disagree with, or nervous about presenting. But our bodies are not fully here with others. They do not communicate as well in the many often very subtle non-verbal ways as they do when we are sharing a physical place. Channels of communication are reduced or flattened to what we can make visible on the screen, or what we can make sayable through a microphone. Communication on an online platform must be explicit, or largely go unnoticed if it's not fully explicit. It must be clearly directed, fully intentional, and leaving no room for all the gradations of human conversation. Observing from a distance, listening into a conversation of unknown others, which is not meant for your ears, making side remarks to your neighbor, all of this is rather difficult online.
I agree with what you said, Stein, of course, and this is quite funny because we actually set this up as having a natural conversation, and you already see how I'm waiting for the camera to make this into a natural conversation, and then it is no longer a natural conversation, and it shows exactly how this form of sociability that produces the type of conversations that we usually have when we are with you in Delhi, in Amsterdam, in Berlin, in Sao Paulo, and all the places where we've been, that is a very different dynamic as what we're trying to put together here. So the sociability that is I think specific and exceptional for the RC21 conference is for me a resource in academic conversations in 2 ways. First of all is the creativity. There's a creativity that comes from thinking aloud together. I think it's very different when we're sitting here and I'm thinking and Stein is going to nod. I know that my thinking is going to take a direction that is going to make it work for him, right? But if we're not having that shared audience together, it's that type of creativity of keep going thinking because of the of the presence of others is going to be difficult. And the second resource is the knowledge that you would not pick up if it wasn't for the conversation between people. That is actually not your conversation. So the creativity in talk of itself and the interrupting in conversations, the interrupting in what is usually seen as impolite, that Stein is now forbidden by the technician sitting over there to interrupt me talking to you because the microphone system is not going to be able to do that thing. And when we have a keynote, we have to sort. So there's all sides of ways in which we now have to deal with sound, in which that affirmation, the sensing of the place, the affirmation of that you get from sensing that people are actually listening to you, or that people are confirming what you say, that is missing. And I think that is affecting both the emotion of a conference experience as well as the affection that comes with doing social science. So the conference, confer in Latin, actually means bringing together, and togetherness draws on proximity. So as to touch and to combine things. And someone asked me recently what this togetherness really feels, what is togetherness sound like for me? What does it sound like? What is the sound of being together? And when we were talking about this morning, we were saying, well, actually, one of the things that togetherness is the silence. So when we have moments of silence in live events, that creates a form of togetherness that we are trying to sort of do as if in this particular moment. Now, I'm not claiming that every keynote at an RC21 conference and every regular conference panel always has these moments of silence, but it is the kind of thing that we think is important to that sense that RC21 is not just a bunch of people presenting PowerPoint presentations, but it actually is also an intellectual community of exchange.
Conferences are also networking spaces, and some of us have been trained by universities in learning how to network. Others are not. Network is not an easy thing to do. I think everybody would readily agree with that. It's hard to plan, or it may be even high threshold to plan for it, to do it according to a particular plan, rather than counting on chance encounters. For example, striking up a conversation while accidentally being seated next to somebody else you wanted to talk to for a long time, or talking to somebody in the queue waiting to pick up your lunch. Academic relations and conversations, just like any other form of social interaction, are byproducts of what we do, are byproducts of what we do when we go about our ordinary lives. An online platform does not leave much space for these kind of chance encounters. There are several ways of making contact also on this online platform, as you will learn or have already learned in the next couple of days. But all of them are clearly directed. They're intentional and they're planned, as the guidelines you received clearly show. It's about making connections, scheduling an appointment, making a call. So it's directed, it's intentional, and it's planned, and not the kind of chance encounters that most of us would make contact to and network to.
Yeah, right, Stein. But I think with that, you've said quite a few things about networking as intentional. So let's talk a little bit about what that means for place, right? Because if it was about intentional network, we have now this really nice chat function that you may have discovered. You can contact people, you can find out who is there, you can click on their profiles and see who they are, and you connect and do intentional networking. But let's talk a little bit about the absence of place and what that means.
Well, place is very important, and I think the whole turn or the whole shift towards online meetings has again taught us a lot of things about the importance of place. Place in organizing conference, as we have tried to do over the past 2 years, in fact, we actually will remember time and time again of how physical place, an actual physical place where we co-present, how that almost organizes as a self-evident framework social life. We have grown, however, used to coordinate our academic lives, our interactions, and our cooperations through being hypermobile. Through time-space compression, we travel long distances very often to meet each other, to have meetings, to write together, to discuss together, to do work, to do research together. But if we all travel to the same place, conference life almost self-organizes around opening and closing plenaries, around paper sessions, coffee breaks, lunches, dinners. It self-organizes itself. With the impossibility of travel, the dysfunctions of virtual mobility as another way of time-space compression, a very powerful way of time-space compression, as we have learned over the past years or past year and a half, the dysfunctions of that become very visible as well. When we were organizing the conference, we had some very tough questions to deal with. For example, at which moment during the day do you schedule a conference? And in line with the global sociology mission of the International Sociological Association, we decided not to organize the conference to fit only European working schedules. That would be too Eurocentric, we thought. But then there is no hour during the day, or maybe just 1 hour during the day, at which most people that would attend the conference in every region of the world would quite comfortably be able to participate, would be comfortably awake and ready to sit after a computer screen to attend a conference. Moreover, we then decided to move the conference in European times to what is the afternoon and the evening. But that, of course, creates problems of its own, because that means that many attendees will find that the conference times will overlap with their daily routines, with their activities of care and family duties, activities and responsibilities that are also much more visible and much more present than if you travel to a different place and at least are not visibly confronted with this care and these other family duties.
Yeah, and maybe one thing that we can also learn from that or think about that in a more sort of doing global sociology kind of way is also that this new sense of place that I think we are sort of experiencing with you not being here and us being here and we not being together is that in the context of people living in diaspora, this sense of a placeless life, that we have to find ways of connecting both temporarily as well as in digital spaces, that is not an entirely new experience for people, and that sense of us having been hypermobile and now maybe not so hypermobile can also be reflected on in what that means in a sort of reflective way of doing our own work. What I do find important about place, and maybe we're starting to repeat ourselves there a little bit, is also that this what you said, now the lunches and the coffee breaks. Is it important to have coffee breaks together? No, it's not so important to have coffee. Although I tell you, the coffee in Antwerp is excellent, but there's a waiting line for coffee, and it's the waiting that's the very useful waste of our times. Like if we don't have Professor so-and-so on the label, we just have your name and your institution, and we may be standing in line and you're this big great scholar and I'm this arriving scholar, and we pick up a conversation just because we know we've just been sitting in the same plenary and we've listened to the same talk. We have what Simo calls a level of partial participation. It's a do as if of that of being interested in one each other being interested in each other while we're standing in line, that then offers a form of communication that is a very different one than when I had to come up to you and introduce myself. And I think we're greatly going to miss the waiting in line with people who we can assume have something similar and with whom we can pick up a conversation.
But we are in a place together. We have this online platform, it's a virtual place, but it is a sort of a place. What kind of a place is this online platform? You will probably discover in the coming days. It's a generic platform. It's built exactly for conferences, dedicated to the activity of conferences and for nothing else. So it only is useful as a kind of place to conferences. Now, we have done our best to give a kind of Antwerp touch to the platform. But the sensory experience of visiting a university building, which is embedded physically as well as socially and mentally in urban life, that kind of sensory experience will probably not be able to mimic or to come close to. Online platforms offer all kinds of degrees of freedom. Participants can take a rest without disturbing anyone else or without looking uninterested. You can change sessions almost instantaneously, so that goes very, very quick. So that offers degrees of freedom which we do not have when we physically co-present in a conference room. However, there were quite a few important constraints as well, constraints that might annoy you in the coming days. All of you will be able to talk on the conference in sessions through using your microphone, using your camera, but only if the speakers or the moderators give you permission to do so. They have to push a button and say, you have to raise your hand, your not your physical hand, but your virtual hand, and then the speaker may decide yes or no to give you the word. So this is a constraint. We can't just intervene as we see fit. But this is how the platform is technically configured, on the basis of how the platform provider, and that's very important to reflect upon, I think, also after the conference. This is based on how the platform provider, how they believe a conference should be.
And that brings us, of course, to the last of the three aspects that we were going to talk about, right? The issue of power, where power in a sort of symbolic interactionist sense, the platform empowers speaking as long as you keep your designated place. So you have to keep that role. And it's not possible to leave it's possible to leave the room. Maybe you've already left, but it's possible to leave the room, but you cannot leave it without us noting that you leave. We have no idea if you're actually still there. So to leave the room ostentatiously, that's a very difficult word, ostentatiously, or to voice spontaneously that you completely disagree with what we're saying, that is completely impossible. And in that sense, there is this sense of power that we've talked a lot and thought about a lot about how to enable that on an online platform.
But there is also power, of course, in the political economic sense of the word. The online platform allows or empowers people from around the world to connect and to participate in the conferences without the often prohibitive costs of traveling and accommodation. Still, digital does not necessarily mean globally accessible or universally accessible. Digital infrastructure, as you all know, is both in social and geographical terms unevenly spread. The quality of the internet connection matters, and we hope we don't have too many problems with that, but it does matter both to listening and to speaking on a conference. Also, online platform costs money, and not a little bit amount of money, quite a significant amount of money. So even if it's online, this conference still requires you to register and to pay a fee. But they also disempower online platforms. Once they are chosen, once they are paid for, and you paid for a particular platform, you're also highly dependent on the platform provider. The platform provider actually retains quite a lot of control, almost total control, over the technological environment, over the particular technological space in which we will meet. In a physical environment, you can tear down a poster which you don't like, you can rearrange the room, you can open and close the door to give access to people. In a technological environment, every feature of this environment is priced. There's a price on there, and if you want to change it, you have to pay extra. It costs money. And in that sense, a virtual space, especially if it's commodified, if it's something that is sold on the market as this online platform, is really more complicated to use than a physical place. For example, we wanted to further in the program, there was a session on presencing and publishing urban studies from Africa, and we wanted to open up this specific plenary, which is organized by Jenny Robinson, to everybody who wanted to attend, even if they are not registered or paid for the conference. That proved very difficult to do. So we couldn't just give, for that one session, just give people access for this one session was very difficult to do, was almost impossible to do. So we had to actually take that session outside of the online program which we paid for to host this conference. Rather ironically, we had to take it outside of this platform to be able to broadcast and live stream to everybody who is willing to look at this particular session.
Yeah, I guess that was a very good solution to that. I think some of the other ways in which we can think in the future about decentralizing these forms of power in digital space is also what I think over the last year we've seen a lot. There's an amazing lot of people that have started making podcasts that are powering ways of speaking that are available to others that I don't think were so massively available to everybody before the pandemic. So we would like to talk about that forever, but we're very scheduled. So we need to make sure that we go on to the next thing in the right moment. So People, Place, and Power, the subtitle of the conference, acquired a rather different meaning over the past year and a half thanks to the pandemic or because of the pandemic. So we're very happy that all of you registered for that today. And let's see how we can shape this conference together with all the limitations that we have in that we can't really sense this as a place in the same way as we planned to talk about sensing place. But we hope that with your participation, we're going to make the best of it. Thank you.
And we're now ready to move to the opening session. And for the opening session, you have to virtually move. So you have to move to room 1, which is the room Ola Danis, but it's also called the Keynote room. And there, Amin is waiting for us to deliver the first keynote. So it's now up to you to leave the lobby and to enter into the virtual room 1, and we'll be waiting there for you to introduce Amin and the first keynote lecture of this conference. See you in just a minute from now. Welcome once again, everyone, to the opening session of this year's RC21 conference. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Amin as the keynote speaker for this opening session of the 2021 RC21 conference. Amin is a professor of geography at the University of Cambridge, and this year he's also the Olaf Palme Visiting Chair at the University of Uppsala, which is also the place from which he will be speaking to us today. Amin is, of course, well known to many of you in the audience for his work on cities, on globalization, on multicultural and race, on the cultural underpinnings of the economy, of the urban and regional economies, and of course many other topics. His latest books include The Land of Strangers out of 2012, Seeing Like a City, together with Nigel Thrift, and Grammars of the Urban Ground with Michel Lancione, who is forthcoming in Duke Press. His current research is on slum ecologies and dwelling practices and the mental health of the poor in Shanghai and Delhi. And it's on this research that Amin will be basing his keynote speaks today. He will be focusing on how subjectivity is made in the intimate dwelling practices of places in the slums of New Delhi. And before I turn over to Ash, who will be speaking to us from Uppsala, just a brief explanation for the audience on how to ask questions and comments, because it works a little bit differently from the other sessions which we'll be having in the next couple of days. So unlike in other sessions at this conference, in which it will be possible to ask the floor by raising your hand and using your mic and your camera, this will not be possible for this keynote session, and the reasons are technical, is because we're live streaming this particular session. So the only way to communicate and ask questions is by using the chat. So Talia and me will moderate the session, and we'll be reading the chat. And so if you want to ask questions, do not wait until the end of the session. You can just post your messages, your comments, your questions, your criticism in the chat, and then Talia and me at the end of the lecture of Ash will be posing the question to Ash, and we will have a sort of question answer round with Talia and me as moderators. So that's how it will work. That's how it will work in practice. But this being said, over to Ash in Uppsala.
Thank you very much, Steen. It's wonderful to be invited. I very much hope you can hear me. I have no idea whether you can hear me. And it seems to me that you've pulled off really quite an amazing achievement here in organizing this conference against all the odds. And listening to you and Talia speak was very interesting. So congratulations. And I'm absolutely sorry to be, I guess, along with the other participants, sorry to be missing Antwerp's. I love this phrase that your alderman used, provincial arrogance. I think it's something that should be the title of a book. And I can say that not least because having been to Antwerp once, it's just such an amazing city. So, but nonetheless, isn't it a marvel that we're still able to have a conference like this, thanks to the social media and the internet? So, responding to the theme of this conference, I posed myself three questions. One is, how should we speak of urban subjectivity, especially of those living on the margins, and without being reduced to the language of victimhood or heroic survival? Secondly, how do we recognize habitat as more than coincidental in explaining bodily states? And then thirdly, how do dwelling practices, where people live, how does habitat fold into the making of people's states of mind, particularly mental health? So these are as you can see from the slide, these are the questions, the kinds of questions that I've been pursuing in my work with Lisa Richaud on the mental health of rural migrants in China. Migrants in China who are widely held to be, in some shape or form, displaced, alienated by modern city life. And here, the literature speaks of a culture shock to the rural mind, and of the city posing many existential challenges because of the peripheral position of these migrants. And this kind of thinking follows a new trend in epidemiology concerned with mental health. So it is assumed that rural migrants in China suffer from major mental health problems in the cities. And of course, an old position also in sociology, which conjectures mental disorder from the city's bewildering pace on the one hand, and Zimmer was emblematic in this reading, and also from many, many urban depredations and deprivations. And our work in China, again, as you see from the slide, has been based in. Now, in our ethnographic work in two neighborhoods of the city, one is an outer suburb facing rapid factory closures. You saw in the first map, called Juting in the southwest of the city. And the other one is the last remaining low-rise block in the central business district, which you see on the right-hand side, Fuzhou Road, where young migrants work in low-paid service jobs. And we found in this work, this was across 3 years, and Lisa was the main person doing the ethnography in Shanghai, we found very little evidence of migrants suffering, let's say, at least from severe mental disorders like schizophrenia or chronic and acute depression, and so on, or indeed also coming to rely either on modern or traditional therapeutic cures. They're either out of the system of medical care or they don't feel the need to use it, usually the latter. And yet what was very interesting is that our informants emphatically speak of facing the unrelented pressures. The word in Chinese that they've always used was yali, the yali of precarity, of uncertainty, of meeting family obligations in the city and back home, of having restricted welfare rights, partly because of the Chinese hukou system, and also facing, because of their position in the labor market, very harsh living and working conditions. We discovered that nestled, sandwiched between yali and mental breakdown, though of course not mild disorders such as listlessness or kind of systemic unhappiness, that sandwiched between yali and mental breakdown, we found that there were very important rituals of what we call, in the work that we've published, rituals of living the moment and of placemaking. In the factory district of Juting, for example, workers and the self-employed negotiate the threat of unemployment and neighborhood decline. By the way, this was not just deindustrialization, but even housing blocks were coming down. You saw from the first image of rubble. Then they were negotiating potential crisis and actual unemployment through various rituals of slowing down time and domesticating crisis, which were manifest in lots of different ways. For instance, prosaic acts of slowing down, of homemaking, of meeting up in the evenings for line dancing, sharing a cigarette and gossip on the streets, playing cards, and watching soaps, endlessly watching soaps on phones in order to stave off boredom and impending doom. And in a similar but slightly different way, in Fuzhou Road, amongst the younger rural migrants, we found them to be enduring low-paid and precarious jobs. They're always moving from jobs. They lose their jobs very easily through such things as casual friendships, a lot of workplace and out-of-work talk, finding respite in public libraries, as you see in this beautiful rosewood furnished library, and also learning to make hope. I think that's the right phrase, through self-help books in bookshops. And here, in both these neighborhoods, we found evidence against sweeping accounts of human subjugation by the metropolis, of subjectivity which is shaped, maybe that's too strong a word, but certainly influenced in everyday dwelling practices. In the iterations of mind, body, and habitat. The choreography of the body in the city and of the city in the body seems to me two central themes to your conference on sensing the city. This choreography we found was turning out to be quite pivotal in the making and the management of mental states. And more recently, I have pursued this interest in, let's call it, cityness and mental health through a new project on the poor in Delhi, initiated in January 2020, but then abruptly interrupted, of course, by the pandemic. And over the few weeks I was there, I worked with a young economist graduate, Gunjesh Kumar, and my colleague at Cambridge, Man Barua. I set out to try and understand the reciprocities of mental states, 1, 2, life circumstances, and 3, settlement conditions. That, in essence, is the kind of orientation of my work in informal settlements and slums at the moment. And we did this by, again, looking at 2 places. One is an old unauthorized colony. That's the kind of jargon that you use in India and for slums. And this is in South Delhi, very close to Jawaharlal Nehru University, JNU, where some 100,000 people are crammed in 15,000 small dwellings of usually vernacular build, tightly packed in narrow alleyways. This place is called Kusumpur Pahari. From now on, I'll just call it Kusumpuri or KP, which is a thriving 30 to 40-year-old slum, close to jobs and amenities in a very prosperous part of South Delhi, where one of India's most prestigious universities located. And though poor and very much under the shadow of the threat of eviction, the colony, the slum, is highly differentiated socially and economically, and has benefited from service upgrading in recent years that has brought in free water, especially in the last 5 years, I would say, free water, electricity, waste disposal, and public toilets. In this colony, private life spills over into the street. The domestic and the commercial are interlaced, while the built environment, always crowded, rudimentary, and often badly kept, folds into daily life in rather intricate and intimate ways. The second area is a strip of land along the Yamuna River in Old Delhi called Yamuna Pushta, a very controversial area where a lot of people, there were massive slum clearances in the 1980s when Delhi was building up for the Commonwealth Games. So it's an area in which there's been a lot of research, there's been a lot of political attention too. But in the here and the present, this is a strip of land along the river in Old Delhi called Yamuna Pushta, which is where the homeless live, or at least until the pandemic, when I think they've been unceremoniously evicted, and where they live in makeshift tents or temporary shelters run by an NGO. This place bears no resemblance whatsoever to Kusumpur. On the upper level of the strip of land, we find the NGO shelters, toilet blocks, food vans, and from time to time, people who set up stall to cut hair or sell you small products. On the lower level, as you can see with that man and the lower picture, on the lower level, running down to the river, camp out the homeless in rudimentary tents, which are dispersed amongst the trees, amongst heaps of rubbish, and as you could probably just about see in the top picture, a massive water pipe. And during our cold days there in January 2020, during the day, the homeless wandered around in blankets, they were huddled around meager fires, or they watched films in one or two of the makeshift cinemas in Yamuna Pushta, most of them craving food, drink, or indeed, very often, drugs. And some of them exhausted from difficult day jobs that they manage to find every now and then. Work is not a regular activity in Yamuna Pushta. And in this place of bare survival, the male migrants are stretched to breaking point, with many of them afflicted by physical and mental disorders, substance addiction, and extreme isolation and stigmatization. Here, the habitat is involved, but it offers no respite at all. So, in today's talk, what I want to do is to describe, and here the word describe is operative, and I'm doing this deliberately, and I'll come to that at the end. I want to describe the states of mind that we encountered, the types of fortitude or distress, with an eye to how biography, space, and dwelling practices are commingled in the bearing of these states. But first, a brief word on my conceptualization of precarity and of precarious subjectivity in the metropolis. In her celebrated work, the book Affliction, based in Delhi's low-income neighborhoods, Veena Das writes of illness and suffering folded into, I quote, the scenes of the everyday. The book encapsulates over 30 years of ethnographic work on violence rendered ordinary by the ongoing drama of survival played out in the open. A drama, Das explains, that is often felt by residents as a form of incomprehension in the lack of correspondence between how they experience their affliction as a kind of daily tribulation and as a sense of somatic rather than mental discomfort, and received medical categorizations of the trauma that these individuals face and their effects. They're, according to Das, if not, they're not bewildered, but they find it puzzling that what they think they're going through seems to be quite different from what psychologists and psychiatrists are saying they are going through. In Das's account, the prosaic and the abnormal absolutely merge, and suffering gets incorporated into the facts of survival, into the bearing of the everyday, and most importantly, into a local vernacular of endurance, including the language of how endurance is experienced. In Das's hands, we are absolutely implored to heed the language of the field. Now, what's really interesting is that in her narrative, the materialities of place, from the agency of infrastructures and the built environment, all the way through to the affordances of place and public land, occupy a minor role in explaining affliction. Cityness seems not to be in the foreground of her writing. But of course, we also have we're lucky enough to have access to another body of work that does look into how practices of inhabitation work their way into subjectivity and life chances. Think of João Biel's powerful work on the mental illness of a woman called Catarina, living in an open asylum in southern Brazil. A kind of mental illness lived out between rooms and the grounds in the asylum. Think of Philippe de Buc's marvelous illustrations of prospects created around broken roads and buildings in Kinshasa, and how this affects the subjectivity of these individuals. Think of Brigu Singh's writing on how Sufi shrines, including their spatial arrangements and their atmospheres, count as part of the therapeutic care of the mentally ill in North India. Think of also Michele Lancioni's close-up portrayal of living with heroin addiction in the underground caverns of Bucharest railway station, where people, addicts or ex-addicts, nestle in around the warm pipelines and cavernous furnishings, which also play their part. In all of this work, you see this very, very organic relationship between the materialities of place, life experience, and mental states. And in turn, of course, within studies of slums and informal settlements in India, the commingling, if that's the correct word, of materiality and subjective fortunes, less so, I think, mental health, is richly illustrated in the work of all the individuals that I've listed on the slide, just to name a few of the scholars. What these scholars do in their detailed ethnographies is highlight the indispensable human and non-human intimacies that come together in making what Abdul Malik Simon has called the unhabitable habitable, but also in the making of slum subjectivities. And then, just to carry on this whistle-stop tour through the conceptual lit, in a similar vein, new writing on the embodied brain, and here I'm thinking of wonderful work by Nick Rose and Des Fitzgerald, and in fact, a new book with Princeton is coming out, if it's not out already, is showing how mental disorders in cities are never of a shock versus response nature, in the sense of the urban environment, preformed, establishing, destabilizing preformed subjectivities. But in this work, what you find is an explanation of mental states formed in the living of specific environments, in the actual experience of space as lived place. Here, how urban space is rendered corporeal, and how the mind is formed in, to quote Kathleen Stewart, in living through things, is considered key in the balances of mental health. And there are some important lessons here to be learned for epidemiologists and people working on mental health questions, including during COVID. We see this orientation illustrated by Hester Parr in her street choreographies of unwell people in Glasgow, by Ola Soderstrom in his walks through Neuchâtel in Switzerland with people with severe mental disabilities who feel safe or threatened by very particular atmospheric conditions in particular parts of the city, and in similar work on the embodied vulnerable mind by Cameron Duff and David Bissell. Here, mental disorders are not at all played down, far from it. They're simply located in bodily experience, where habits of habitat are folded into the neuroscience of the brain. Very interesting work. So let's look at the intricacies of spatial subjectivity understood in these ways by unpacking the states of endurance that I encountered. Firstly in Kusumpur and then in Yamuna-Pushta. And what I want to do here is I really want to try and draw out, if possible, the connections between mental well-being and dwelling practices. And following thus, and particularly in this talk, which some of you might find coming very close to being quite descriptive, I want to stay very close to the language of endurance that is used by our interlocutors. This paper, in a sense, is a kind of homage to the people we encountered in these two places. Now, one of the one state of endurance is, as you see on the slide, fortitude. The first person we met in Kusumpur Pahari on a cold January day, feeling quite anxious about whether anybody would talk to us about material well-being, about mental well-being, was somebody who we've called Surender, a caretaker at JNU and a part-time pig keeper. We were lucky, he welcomed us immediately. We were very surprised to hear from him speaking openly about the difficulties of slum life. He talked about the cramped housing, the constant threat of eviction, the wayward behavior of some neighbors, the graft of keeping his children on the right side of the law. And in the middle of the conversation, completely unsolicited, Surender chose to speak of the fine line between survival and abjection. By talking about the trials that he faced and the family faced when he once broke his leg, which nearly led to his bankruptcy because of the threat of the loss of his job. But fortunately, he managed to keep his job, and financial help for his leg came from his extended family. And when we asked him what kept him going, without hesitation and stamping his big herding stick on the ground, he spat out majbuti. This Hindi word means fortitude, more or less, and which Surender himself understood to mean then an inner determination not to fail. Later, in another part of the colony, we met a senior resident with a big handlebar moustache and a booming voice, displaying all the confidence of an old timer. This individual too spoke of majbuti, despite the difficulties he'd encountered. So he'd established a successful truck and construction business. He was an early inhabitant, so he ended up building quite a big house. He had an extended family there, but his difficulties started when his son developed a had kidney failure. He had to sell the business. All the money was used to deal with his son. But what he did was he spoke of majbuti. He said, I'm strong, but I'm strong. There I go by the grace of God. He constantly switched between talking about his fortitude as his own and as something that that God has given him in the form of good fortune. Now, from these encounters, it would be very easy to stay with personality traits and biographical experience to explain the two men's fortitude or tenacity. But a more complete picture has to acknowledge the affordances of the urban fabric, I think. The infrastructural improvements that have taken place, which have taken the sting out of the daily grind of meeting basic needs, the opportunities that arise from conversations and observations in public space. Of course, also the role of family ties and familiarity rooted in neighborhood and its ways. The colony's proximity to the prosperous part of South Delhi, close to JNU and the work there. And above all, they are who they are because of the labor of their wives and daughters that enable their majbooti. The gendered character of fortitude was really quite telling. And telling in the sense that when we spoke to women about endurance, they didn't use the language of majbooti at all. They used the language of forbearance, of bearing up with things, and of putting up with an almost unbearable load of keeping family and home intact. So let me come to this now. It is without question women, young and old, who hold together life in the colony, typically waking up before dawn to get the family ready for the day, perhaps going out for paid work, and staying up late to finish work for the next day. Violence against the women from husbands is common, and it brings them to the edge of severe mental disorders, such as acute depression. But often following Das, they describe these mental conditions as, I feel a bit listless, I'm lacking energy today, I feel a bit distracted. There's a immense somatization of what are really quite serious mental anxieties. What they do is they endure. They convince themselves to be free from mental disorders, yet they remain all too close to the edge of desperation. And which is when often the familiarities of place and neighborliness can intervene. And let me just mention two cases because time is short. One is a woman called Gita in her late 40s. She loses her husband in 2016, is left with a 1,000 pound debt, outstanding loan on her husband's rickshaw. She's poor, she's without a job, she has 3 children, a son who works, and 2 daughters who don't. But her circumstances are truly challenging. Yet when we met her, she was, by character, optimistic, outspoken, resolute, confident, absolutely confident that she can get the rickshaw back into service. But moving away from her, place, I think, has played its part as well by offering neighbors from her region, which is Bihar, neighbors in whom she can confide, by offering free water and electricity, a modest, cost-free home, plenty of outdoor conversations from which opportunities may arise, economic opportunities, and some lightening of her worries when she gathers with other women every week to collect drinking water from municipal trucks. My point is that her subjectivity, including her forbearance, is performed with and through the intimacies of place, whatever that means. Quickly turning to my second example, in an opening not far from where Gita lives, close to where a municipal toilet block is located, on most days we found a group of women huddled around a fire, fed by wood taken from a nearby forest. That's the open space I'm talking about. These are widows or abandoned women facing a steady decline and describe themselves as neglected in every respect, including by the neighborhood. If they spoke of not giving up with some defiance, their eyes betrayed a sense of deep desperation. Their forbearance was pretty much on the edge. And I think their fall may well be just a matter of time. And it might well be quite a hard fall. But their tenacity cannot be denied. And one of their fourth acquaintance stood there close to a nearby school, trying to sell whatever small goods that she could in order not to fall. For her too, her forbearance drew upon the fact that she was in an open public space, close to neighbors who she knew, and kids who she knew who could go buy things. The smallest of possible things of place matter. Now, if place has so far appeared as a form of affordance, keeping severe mental health at bay, Yamina Pushta is a space in which habitat, socioeconomic circumstances, and biographies meet to reinforce mental instability. Here, the role of intermediaries, such as NGOs providing care services, in regulating the fine line between bare life and hope is really quite pivotal. And let's see how before I conclude my talk. Typically, in Yamina Pushta, the men sheltering under flimsy bamboo structures have become homeless after a family feud or accident or after years of poverty and migration in search of work. They're left without vital identity documents that would give them access to welfare care. The men may manage to find 3 to 4 hours or 3 to 4 days of work as a month as workers, as load pullers or cleaners. And they spend most of the rest of their time, that's something like 28 days of the week, of the month, passing the day by playing Ludo or cards, sitting around fires, walking around, sifting through the rubbish for recycling items. These are damaged men, mercifully fed by the NGOs, and of course they have access to free water and sanitation on the upper ledge of Yamuna Pushta, without which their state of health would descend to the worst forms of bare life. There is no question about that. And in fact, they're not that far distant from that. Their safety net is flimsy. Their surroundings are inhospitable. Without any of the supportive social, physical, and commercial infrastructure of Kusumpur. In this situation, the presence of NGOs such as the Center for Equity Studies, chaired by Harsh Manda, which provides temporary housing for men of a certain age, and also helps the homeless to access vital ration cards or blankets or identity cards, or indeed even medical treatment, is the thin thread to a possible life. There's no other way of putting it. So perhaps I could sketch a portrait of 3 people to illustrate the powers of intermediation in spaces in which the affordances of neighborliness and habitat are absent. And in doing this, to add something new to locating subjectivity in the language of dwelling by recognizing the institutional dimensions of place. In Kusumpur Pahari, these are community centers, shrines, temples, shops, and education and medical services. And in Yamuna Pushta, it is in the form of the all too important NGO providing food or something else. So I may not have time for 3 examples, just keeping an eye on the time. I might just do 2. One lucky resident of the NGO housing shelter was a man called Milan, a man in his mid-50s who spoke perfect English. He told us of his journey from childhood in a prosperous family, but where a gambling father squandered everything, to becoming a store manager in Lucknow, and then ending up in Delhi 10 years ago after a series of what he described as mishaps. Very interesting, these biographies of the poor. They don't start out poor. Troubled by asthma, Milan could work couldn't work, and he expressed enormous gratitude for the free housing, food, and services he received, ever hopeful that with the help of official papers and medicine that the NGO could procure for him, he could return to work. We are back to Majbuti, but this is of a very quiet kind. But we're also back to the significance, the absolute significance of rather threadbare community care programs in sustaining his well-being and his hope. I was going to give you a second example of a woman who is suffering from severe cancer, but I don't have time to speak to that. But let me just come to my final example. Stein, I'll be another 5 minutes. My final example is Zainab, who is lucky to live with her 2 young children in an NGO-run permanent shelter for the homeless close to Old Delhi's majestic Jama Masjid Mosque. On the image you see here, top right and bottom right is the shelter. Compared to Yamuna Pushta, just a few miles down the road, the shelter is a haven for women with young children who are able to lead a substance-free life in a leafy compound where there are 2 or 3 dormitories, kitchens, and play areas. Only the very few are able to get into these rare permanent shelters, which can become homes. For Zainab, who is now a paid volunteer, the shelter has been that one lucky break in a life absolutely riddled with misfortune. How close we sail to the wind. With quiet and unhesitating eloquence, when we asked Zainab just to tell us about her life, she told us about her life as a child beggar at Jama Masjid, later as a drug addict and a prostitute, a resident of a rehousing slum in faraway Bawana when Yamuna Pushta was cleared of slums, and where she lost her son in a fire, but also witnessed her 1-year-old daughter, can you believe this, being raped and then becoming a separated wife who struggled against all the odds to go clean so as to provide for her children. Zainab's fortitude and determination were all too evident. There must have been a lot of all of this in order to go through what she's gone through. But so was the care of the NGO in its offer of care, counseling, shelter, community, and of course also work. And it was hit and miss. Our informant who works for the Center for Equity Studies happened to know Zainab many, many years ago, and he happened to help her out. This is how fragile things are. So let me then come to a conclusion. This study has set out to look at the reciprocities of place and body in the making of states of mind. Behind the chaos, cramped conditions, and existential challenges in Kusumpur Pahari, as in India's multitude of informal settlements, you find a neighborhood vernacular woven into practices of endurance. This comes in the form of, firstly, piecemeal social efforts of housing and infrastructural upgrading, which are then culminating in the installment of free public services in Delhi just in the last few years. Secondly, neighborhood familiarities and socialities of various kinds, including in public spaces and the Maidan on the top right-hand image, a large open area. C, the easy spillover of the private into the public, where your anxieties and your worries can be temporarily suspended, and this is not a small thing. D, the steady arrival of NGOs offering creches, primary education, practical training opportunities, and medical facilities, bottom right. And E, the presence of, sorry, not bottom right will come in a minute. E, the presence of temples, wayside resting places, and public spaces like the Maidan, where moments of stillness can be found, along with the chance, of course, to exchange helpful news in the way that Abdul Malik Simon has shown so frequently in his wonderful work. In all of this, what's interesting is that it is not community that's at work, but instead place made habitable in socially intimate ways. This is quite different from community. This is not the case at all in Yamuna Pushta, where the sheer barrenness of things, the sameness of bare life, and the very rudimentary nature of habitat conspire against body and mind. Place here is an encumbrance. It gets in the way, reducing mental well-being to inner resolve, if you have it, good fortune, if you have it, bodily strength, if you have it, and various forms of escape into the phantasmagorical, either a night spent in the cinema or through some form of intoxication. Personhood here is tested to the limit amidst multiple deprivations, discrimination, and self-abuse. Here, the significance of the care industry, if you could call it that, which in India is so heavily dependent on hit and miss municipal effort and underfunded NGOs, can't be overstated. Here, if place matters, it is in the form of its intermediaries. Take away the shelters, the mobile clinics, the centers that treat drug addicts and the mentally ill, the committed NGO workers and volunteers. But also, it has to be said, the strides taken by the Delhi authorities in recent years to attend to the poor, quite unlike the national government, the homeless in Yamuna Pushta would be in a much worse state. To be clear, the support that they get is basic, it's sporadic, it's rudimentary, it's stretched. But it is a vital lifeline for the few who manage to get access. Let's not forget, the recovery shelters of Delhi catch some hundreds of people out of 200,000 homeless people in the city, and only 5% of them possess the identity documents needed to get access to food rations and medical care. So, to close, COVID has wiped out the care industry in places like Yamuna Pushta. It's stigmatized the homeless even more, now labeled as carriers of disease, and it's forced the desperate into even worse circumstances in a city in which their survival depends on the presence of crowds on the street, because through the presence of crowds on the street and their presence in these crowds, some kind of possibilities might arise, as Aman Sethi has shown in his fantastic biography of a young kid in Delhi. The affordances of place in Kusumpur Pahari will have also evaporated during COVID as the pandemic forces residents back into the dark interiors. I shudder to think what has happened to the people whose vernacular intelligence, forbearance, and equanimity I found so moving 15 months ago in the cold days of January in Delhi. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Amin there in Sweden. This is like the oddest moment, because we're all applauding in our living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, attics, wherever we're hiding, trying to listen to you. We've collected a few questions, and I think we're going to suggest to you that I'm going to give you two, and then you take like maybe 4 minutes to answer those, and then Stein will collect the next two, and then meanwhile we're watching the chat. So we've not been trained to do any of this, so we're just going to give it a try. So one of the questions, first of all, there's a question of if there's other words for the word of fortitude and forbearance that you use. Thank you. And oh no, we're not supposed to touch. It's COVID. So And Axel was asking you especially to what extent the question of fortitude and forbearance is also related to religion, and what the role of religion is in there. And I think that links in quite well with the question, both of what if there's other terms to think about that, and maybe also with the question to what extent the focus on fortitude can create an glorifying endurance. Now everybody can see in the chat who asked that question, because I didn't note down the name. These two things, right? The fortitude and the forbearance. To what extent is that is that linked to religion, and is there a risk of glorifying it? And maybe we can add to that a little the question of what habitat and gender is doing in your talk, because when you make the triology of mind, body, and habitat, gender wasn't an explicit category in what you build up, and yet it's the men and the women that you kind of separated between the fortitude and the forbearance. I'm interested in hearing more about, is that the habitat of women that makes them forbearing, or is it where is that difference between the men and the women coming about for you?
Okay, thank you very much. A couple of really interesting and important questions. So I'm not a fluent speaker of Hindi. I do speak Gujarati, and I don't know what the Hindi word for forbearance is, and forgive me for that. Fortitude, as I said, expressed by men, it was majbuti. But the kinds of sentiments that go with forbearance is along the lines of, and it's, the equivalent English words would be, what choice do I have? I'm just putting up with things. If I can't, if I go under, then so does everybody else. A lot of people are dependent on me. So it's this kind of forbearance as a kind of involuntary endurance, if you like. No, it's not. There's nothing declarative about it, in the way that there is about Majbuti. So I think the first gendered aspect here actually comes in the choice of words. How is it that you describe your condition? And it's, again, we talk to a lot of younger women who are retraining in some shape or form by doing hairdressing courses or sewing classes or kind of very traditional forms of activity. And what their language was when we asked these questions about not going under, how do you cope, what hope do you have, how do you, there were no words, oddly enough. Perhaps it was a kind of shyness with us or amongst themselves. Everything was just revealed in the face, okay? Faciality suddenly became so pertinent in explaining their sense of mixture of forbearance, quiet dignity, and a sense of, there's nothing else I can do. Because I'm surrounded by a gendered social environment in which, I can't quite do what I really, really want to do unless I have permission of the men of the house, ranging from brothers to fathers and husbands. A lot of these young women are married in their late teens. So there is, of course, an absolute risk of glorifying forbearance, endurance, not having, and saying also that these women and men don't actually suffer from mental disorders. There is that absolute risk. But I think what I'm trying to argue is that the very fact that you have these forms of endurance of habitability, of making the best out of really quite dire circumstances, and where making the best actually is also facilitated by the environment, which is what I've been trying to say during my talk. These things I think are really important. They need to be recognized. I don't think they're a form of glorification. They're recognition of all the strategies that people deploy, and we often describe, say for ourselves as members of the middle classes, that actually the working class also and the poor also have these, if you like, means of survival, means of dignified survival. Okay. So I know I'm talking much longer than you wanted me to, but just a quick final comment. So gender comes into this in the most usual structural ways that we understand, as a whole series of gender inequalities in family life, in the economy, but interestingly not so much in place. I mean, something that I noticed, and it was really quite poignant, was maybe because of neighborhood socialities and things like that, the ongoings of public space, just in Kusumpur Pahari, not in Yamuna Pushta. Yamuna Pushta is exclusively male. Habitat comes in as a kind of equalizer of gender relations in public space and in public life in Kusumpur Pahari. The violence or gendered violence happens pretty much within the home.
Stijn, you're gonna.
Okay, the questions keep on coming in through the chat. Probably too much for you to follow, Ash, in the chat. But maybe another a range of questions. There was a question from Katrien Grossman, and she was wondering whether the way help was given to the people, to the subjects you were analyzing or studying, the way the help was given, whether that mattered, whether you could more about the specific ways in which this help was given. For example, does it communicate inferiority, or is it respectful, delivered in a respectful way? So she was wondering whether you could tell a little bit more about the way help was given to people. Then there was another question from Axel Ersoy about the post-pandemic cities, and she was. Or Axel was wondering whether the spatial materiality of the city, the life experience and the mental changes urban subjectivities in different ways in the post-pandemic, well, it's not really post-pandemic, in the pandemic cities as it were. And then there were maybe one or two questions I would like to take together. One from Maria Jose Alvarez Rivadula, and she was wondering about the mediating organizations. And she was wondering about another set of organizations, for example, political parties or brokers, to what extent they were involved in mediating the endurance and the what a kind of effect that would have on the mental state. And I think that linked to a question of Sanzu Sivilek. And Sanzu was wondering about moments of politicization or depoliticization around endurance. So I guess the question there is to what extent does endurance leave has potential for politicization of practices, or whether it depoliticizes endurances or the situations in which people live. All right.
I mean, you've given me 4 questions, which are going to take a very long time to answer if I had the time. So I'll try and be as telescopic as I possibly can. The ways in which help is given varies quite a lot. So in Kusumpur Pahari, oddly enough, it's been institutionalized, where you have these creches and training centers, things that are offered from the likes of the Rotary Club. And so they're on a non-paid basis. If you get onto the list, you go in, as you would in any institution, and you will be treated with dignity. One primary school that we were in Kusumpur Pahari, set up not by the state, but by local volunteers, broke the mold in many ways by giving, treating the young kids in immensely loving and kind ways, which is unusual, because very often help is given in top-down, sometimes patronizing ways. and above all in Yamuna Pushta. But again, an exception to that, the Center for Equity Studies that Harsh Manda set up, and he's a very, very powerful social activist in India. I saw that the kinds of care that were given with real kind of dignity and kindness, whether this was in the drug addiction centers or recovery centers from physical and mental difficulties. Where the help seems a bit of a shock is not so much in the care of the individuals who are giving the help, but just the rudimentary nature of it. I mean, in Yamuna Pushta, one of the shelters, the conditions inside of people who are suffering from TB or AIDS or mental disorders, I mean, these are rough conditions, you know. The kind of help that's provided is very, very threadbare. So let me move on to the next question, because I could say more on this, which is the post-pandemic city. Again, two brief comments, observations, which I began to touch on. Yamuna Pushta has been cleared out pretty much, particularly in the early days, you know, when through this immediate and grotesque vilification of the homeless, who are seen to be carriers of disease. And so, you know, what has happened to them, I don't know. I'm so eager to go back to Delhi whenever I can, just to see what's going on in Yamuna Pushta. I'm told there's much less life there. The NGOs have been told to keep away because of public health risks. So, you know, what you're seeing in the evacuation of the public sphere in the post-pandemic city is the removal of a means of life for the poor, people who live on the streets. That's tough. In Kusumpur Pahari, again, I don't really know a great deal what's been happening in the last year and a half, but I think what's been going on, or I imagine what's been going on, is people have retreated into the privacy of the home as much as possible. And particularly, you know, when things really flared up a few months ago. I mean, I shudder to think from a medical and epidemiological perspective, what's been happening in terms of the rapid circulation of the disease and how terrified people must be. Of course, they would have probably lost their jobs. There is no furlough. Public spaces there, which were places where you could meet to do all the things I described, that's kind of gone. These are dangerous places, spaces. So retreat into the home. Mediating organizations, what's the role of parties and political movements? A lot. So, you know, a lot of the political parties, particularly the BJP, the party of the current government, which started out as a kind of grassroots movement many years ago, they are ever present in the slums. They organize. They often, the political parties vie with the religious organizations to construct new communities, to influence thought. And just one small example, when we were there was a group of young men, by that I mean people early 20s to early to mid 30s, who were actually part of the militant wing of the BJP, who took us under their wing and were really kind to us, you know, but they had a kind of steely resolve in terms of they knew what was good for the basti, for the slum. They knew, they acted as the gatekeepers in terms of who's in and who's out. They know that when the JNU students show up in the slum to do some studies, how they ought to be treated and rapidly evacuated. So the hand of the political parties as a, not even a subaltern force, but as a kind of force organizing social and other forms of and religious life in the slums is important. And yet at the same time, it's on the margins, it's kind of sideline, it doesn't affect everyday life. Again, a lot to be said here. And the final question really was moments of politicization in endurance? Yes, not as much as you would like, because I think endurance is a form of depoliticization. It is a form of survival in the best possible way that you could. It is a form of not quite withdrawal, but just getting on. How can I put it? With the business of life. But where you do see politicization is when the rumors start circulating that there is an impending eviction. Then people do, the gossip and the conversations turn into something much more political, much more informed. And you're talking about a public here, less so in Yamuna Pushta than in Kusumpur Pahari, which is very well informed, educated kids, professional workers, and such like. So politicization there happens in two forms. One is and everywhere in India, everybody has an opinion and everybody knows what's going on. But secondly, also in getting together to organize against evictions, not in the way that they did in the 80s, but around significant. If leaders emerge from within the community and there's a collective threat, people will come together. And the final form of politicization, of course, is in the form of gang cultures, coercive organizations, and so on, which are kind of there in the background as well. So, and sometimes they step into the foreground when somebody or something is stepping out of line.
Thank you. And the more you share with us, the more questions are going to come to us. The last point, maybe where you ended, is the point to pose you the last question by Diti Bhattacharya, who asked you, what about caste, and how do you include the caste, the notion of caste in the story? Maybe you can say a little bit about that. I have two other questions posed. First of all, by Laila Zibar, who on the concept of endurance asks you about to what extent the dimension of time. Now you've addressed the dimension of location or space, but she wanted to ask you about the notion of time and to what extent endurance is linked to temporary, belonged or prolonged or permanent things. Now, to what extent that concept can be used in all these three contexts. And then Louise Follon has a more methodological question, which I think we can spend a lot of time listening to you about that, which is, how do you do this methodologically, combining materiality and mental states? And was that an interdisciplinary event, or did you include psychologists? And I guess that is also something that we've been thinking about here, what is exactly the psychiatric understanding then of mental health, and how is this? When we talk, because you say it easily, right? You say mental health, but where is the notion of what does that mean, and is that an individualized notion of the person being healthy, and if so, what does that mean methodologically, also in terms of how do you talk to people about mental health, which presumes a language to talk about mental health, and then you said it's in their face. So I like to hear more about how you did that, how you do that as a research practice.
Okay, thank you. Given time is short, I'll just make one or two prefatory remarks on the first point, and then spend a little bit more time in the second two. But if I'm running out of time, just interrupt and tell me. So, caste is everywhere. It really is everywhere, as is region, as is class. So look at Kusumpur Pahari. It's differentiated in class terms. People who live close to each other's neighbors do so because of caste, and they will also do so because of religion. Okay, Muslims and Hindus living in different parts of the slum. And they do so also because of caste. Surendra, the first person we met, was a Dalit. And in kind of unkind language, referred to as untouchables many years ago. And he didn't really speak explicitly about caste, but it was clear that things that he said about his experience of the slum is caste inflected, no doubt about it. At the opposite end, two priests who we got to know, one's spiritually oriented, another one just doing his business, who were Brahmins, looked upon and down on most of the people in Kusumpur Pahari with a degree of mild contempt. So, look, caste is everywhere. Sorry, I'm forgetting the names of the people who've asked the questions. The question on time in endurance is a fantastic question. It's really important. And time is both, it's short, it's long, it's rhythm, it's repetition as well. So the work in China with people hanging out in the self-help bookstores, in the bookstores, or in Juting amongst the closures, that is a stretching of time in the mind around a temporary moment of feeling extraordinarily vulnerable because of closures of one kind or another. In Kusumpur Pahari, the women experiencing or talking about forbearance in some shape or form, that is time not of a long durée, but its rhythm is there and is there all the time. So this is a long stretched out endurance, which, because of its length and for which there is not a horizon, can become utterly painful. Okay, this is long-term, stretched out endurance. And then you've got other forms of endurance, I suppose, like the man with the handlebar moustache, who I didn't speak much about. For him, endurance, majbuti in this case, fortitude, sorry, it's temporal. For him, the temporality is almost, how can I say, post-secular. Okay, I endure in a spiritual time in which God has given me for as long as I'm on this earth, the capacity to be strong. Okay, so there are, but your question about the temporality of endurance is a really, really amazing question, and I haven't really thought about it much. These are kind of open thoughts. Methodology. So this is a tough question. In my defense, I have to say I'm at the start of this work in Delhi. The China work has been going for a longer time, and it's collaborative work between an ethnographer, a geographer like me, Nick Rose, and others definitely working at the kind of psychology, psychiatry end of things, including the people in the School of Public Health at Fudan University. So there, having the luxury of an interdisciplinary team allows you to cross-reference an anthropological perspective and a geographical perspective with a psychiatric perspective. And you agree, you disagree, you begin to see each other's perceptions, and you come to some sort of joint perspective. Let's put it that way. I didn't have that luxury in the field in Delhi, and so much of what I've had to say today is, in some ways, if I'm being honest, it's undigested and heavily dependent upon my own feelings and perceptions, what I could read in people's faces, what I could interpret from their language. And of course, remember here, God is the language is being translated for me, so that brings other difficulties as well. But there, I was lucky in making contact with somebody in IBHAS, which is a medical institution, a very inspiring psychiatrist. And we talked quite a lot. We compared notes in terms of what how he saw the experience, and if you like, how he read the faces of people suffering. How I read the faces of people in the hospitals that I visited were clearly people who were suffering from all kinds of mental traumas, and how people within the slum itself and the NGOs that I was working with spoke of people with mental difficulties who were nearby or who we could see or who were being treated. So here the methodology was about based on cross-referencing, on getting extra communicative intelligence, perspectives of people there. I see you waving your hand, so you want me to stop.
Yes. No, and this is like I would slip you the note that says 1 minute, if we were sitting in the same space, which we're not. But I have one more question. I think that we want to ask you as the last one before we wrapped up. That Ernest has asked us, which is Ernest Sewodo has asked us, which is if you're framing this analysis in gendered relations of forbearance and endurance, then how would you think about encountering people who... Did you encounter people who have an identity as an LBGTQI or the LBGTQ, he wrote LBGTQ plus personalities, and if yes, how did you situate them in what is gender-wise within the two communities you are studying?
My encounters were by and large people who declared as men or women, and with the exception of once in one of the NGO supported recovery shelters, where for people with medical illnesses but also mental health illnesses, there was one young person there, young woman, who self-identified as a woman, but had been born a biological man, and what was interesting was that amongst the people caring for her, I mean, her story was quite interesting. She was the son, latterly daughter, of a very wealthy Singaporean family who, I think because of drugs, possibly, I don't know, ended up in pretty much homeless on the streets of Delhi, and was then picked up and brought to this recovery shelter, and had been there when we were there for weeks. Urban, savvy, articulate, but not quite sure about her mental state and what she's suffering from or having to endure. I don't know enough on how the patients viewed her, because all the other patients in that particular shelter were women. But when we talked to the person in charge of the shelter on that day when we were there, she made it pretty clear that in actual fact the people were not making these sorts of certainly not discriminations or or vexed by her sexuality. But that's about the only case that I can even remotely come close to speaking about.
Okay. Thank you, Ash, for kicking off the conference with such an inspiring talk and triggering so many questions from the audience. We will be wrapping up here, just to allow people to move to the next sessions if they want to do so. So thank you very much, and you will have to imagine that there is a resounding applause now, which I'm sure there is, but not, of course, actually sounding. So thank you very much for being with us. And for the people in the audience, we'll continue with the conference in just 10 minutes from now. We have 2 more slots of paper sessions this evening or this afternoon, depending on where you are. We will update you on the topics of these sessions, of course, in the general chat, which you can also freely use to advertise your sessions or your papers. But you can also consult the program to see what's coming up. So we have 2 more sessions at 6 p.m. and 8 p.m. Central European summertime. And then tomorrow, for the people that leave us now, tomorrow we start at 12 p.m. Central European summertime with a semi-plenary of Friederike Landau on infrastructuring activism. Thank you very much again, Ash, for kicking off the conference, and for the other people, we'll see you in hopefully one of the next sessions. Thank you for being with us. Bye.
Maar hij ziet ons.
Hallo.
Hallo, Ash. We were trying to find the right. We were trying to make sure that nobody is overhearing